So I want to do a shoot this week with almost no pre-production and immediately felt it on set. Now, nothing completely fell apart. The shoot still happened. We still got usable footage, but it was a way more stressful experience for me than it should have been. It wasn't as clean and concise as I wish it would have been for the client. And overall, everything was just way harder than it needed to be. Welcome back to The Attic, where I talk honestly about making a living as a videographer, telling stories I care about, and creating things that I'm proud of. So for a little bit of context on this shoot, I talked about this process a couple episodes ago of how I landed an editing job for a podcast. Well, this was the shoot that I originally pitched to that client when I approached them to do some free spec work for them. I pitched this idea for a little mini branded doc on a big project that he's working on and developing this piece of property. And what he said is, I would love to do that. And also, I have this podcast that would be great for you to edit. So technically, this was a free shoot. This was spec work for me, but it did pay dividends in other ways. Now, even if it hadn't, this still would have been a win for me. This was a really exciting project and an opportunity to tell some stories that I really care about, to interview some people that have a lot of influence, whose stories are really impactful, and to try some different kinds of cinematography that I'm also excited to dive into. But because of the constraints of the way this worked, there was very little room for any pre-production. I had never seen the location where we would be filming. I didn't know the exact time frame in which we would be filming. I didn't know what gear I would need. I didn't know what the set would look like. Technically, we hadn't talked through interview questions, so I loaded up pretty much every piece of kit I own into my car, drove out to an undisclosed location. I had to follow somebody to get there and had to assess really quickly on the fly how I was going to light, frame, and ultimately produce this interview shoot. So what I want to do is I want to show you a little bit about what we ended up with and talk to you about some of the mistakes I made and some of the things that I would do different. Now, thankfully, we were in this beautiful cabin location with a fireplace that made a beautiful backdrop for this image, but it was also a really dynamic and challenging shot because we had windows right behind our subjects. So in a perfect world, I would have loved to be able to expose for outdoors and then bring up the light ambiently in the room to have nice exposure across the frame. Well, unfortunately, because it was a two-person interview, this was really challenging. It was just me. I was all by myself on this one. So initially I had thought that I wanted to do a reverse cross key, boom in lights behind our subjects on either side, cross key them so that I could still shoot shadow side, have nice exposure. But what I found out quickly was just given the size of the room, which was compressed, there wasn't going to be space to do that and still have my lights and my C-stands out of the frame. Now, in hindsight, what I wish I would have done was shoot it that way anyways, with the lights in frame, and then pull the lights out and capture a clean slate that I could have maxed in. Because what I ended up doing was having a tighter shot than I wish I would have, which just didn't show off the space well, and it wasn't as cinematic as I would have liked. So what I ended up doing was just booming in one China ball over the top, one lantern sort of right in between them, still behind them so I could shoot shadow side. But the mistake I made, because I didn't do any pre-production, is I was really rushed for time on setup. I was hoping I would have an hour to set this up, and really I had like 20 minutes, and the client was just sort of standing there watching me. So I felt a lot of insecurity and time pressure to get this shoot rolling. So I just boomed in that one light. I didn't really bother to check exposure. I didn't check my false color or my waveform. I just sort of like set it so it looked good enough on the monitor, press record, and off we went. Now, unfortunately, what this led to was a pretty underexposed image. So I'll show you here on the screen right now. This is the image. Right now it's in S-Log. So this is just my log Direct 709 conversion. So you can see it doesn't look too bad, but once I start bringing in contrast and some of those different coloring pieces, the exposure really drops. So I have a couple CSTs here. That's going from S-Log into a DaVinci Wide Gamut color space, and then this gets me back to log because my conversion LUT is expecting S-Log 3 to convert to Rec 709. So let me show you kind of where we start going from here. I'll tweak my white balance a little bit. This is where I bring in a bunch of contrast, and that's what really drops the exposure of the image. So I have my HDR node at the very front to bring that exposure back up, and now I start getting into some of the creative. So this is just sort of my split toning, my teal and orange look, which I really like, adding in some saturation, protecting my skin tones. And now what I'm doing is just trying to bring up the exposure on my two subjects without touching the rest of the room, because I'm still trying to keep as much highlight information in those two windows as I possibly can. And then the other thing I'm actually doing is a gradient exposure change decreasing the exposure from the top of the image down, because without this, you can see that mantle where the China ball is sitting, where the lantern is sitting, is just a little hot. So bringing that down, bringing in a little bit of halation. And then this is a 2383, just kind of film stock, just to bring in a little more contrast, a little bit of that punchy color. And then I'm playing with my black level here as well. So ultimately, this was the final image that I ended up with. Pretty happy with how it looks. I like the color, I like the character, I like the texture. Ultimately, though, I wish I had retained a little more information in the sky in those two windows, and I wish I had a wider frame. I don't love how far out my subjects are. I wish there was more space on either side of them for a more dynamic shot. And ultimately, you know, this image is a touch softer than I wish it would have been as well. So I shot this on the DZO Vespid, the 21mm, and I had to be really close. Normally, actually, my FX30 would be my A cam with that lens, but I switched it to the A7 IV, so I'd have the full sensor, so I'd have the full focal length, and it just was hard. You know, this was a smaller room, so it was hard to get far enough back to get the width that I would have liked. I did have a B cam on this shoot as well. You can kind of see here, I just had to actually manually go back and forth between the two subjects because I only had one camera. The angle is different. I would have liked to have one on either side shooting cross, but I just had one right here on camera right, operator right, and so I was just panning back and forth depending on who was talking at any given point in time. So, you know, I still have some exposure matching to do on that shot. Generally speaking, I'm really happy with the frame. The content in the interview is really good. I think we still captured what we needed, but I learned a couple huge lessons, and that is never skip pre-production. I think my own insecurity led me to not to want to ask the client for the extra time. I felt like to a certain extent they were sort of doing me a favor, and I think in hindsight that was the wrong way to look at this, just by letting me film this for them. Actually, I'm providing them immense value with this interview and shooting it for free. So there's just some of that imposter syndrome that I'm still actively working out through this process, and ultimately their experience, my experience, and the final product would have been better had I just asked for what I needed and allotted the appropriate amount of time in the setup, in the pre-production. And that way too, I could have thought more critically outside of the pressure cooker of being on set about how I wanted to light this, about whether or not I wanted to capture a clean slate wide to be able to mask out those lights, right? Some of these different techniques that in the moment, because I was under pressure, I just didn't think about. So that is the bummer on this shoot. That is the major lesson that I learned. So while we shot all the interviews here on the Vespid, on the 21mm on the wide and the 50mm on the tight, I do still have a bunch of B-roll I need to go capture on this beautiful farm property that is a part of this story, which actually brings me to a piece of gear that I am considering buying, and that is the Remus anamorphic lens set by Blazar. I'm sure you've seen these. They're all over YouTube. They look like a really beautiful lens, really beautiful image, and I've been interested in anamorphic shooting for a long time. I think it's the kind of thing that could just elevate this kind of production even higher. Now, the rub is for me, do I ultimately need it to shoot beautiful images? No, of course I don't. But I found possibly a really great deal on a used set of 4 lenses. I think it's the 33, the 50, the 85, and the 125. If I can get that used for like $2,500, I'd be really tempted to pull the trigger on those lenses, because I think they would just elevate that creative work that much more, inspire me to create, and just be another tool in the toolkit for telling stories and creating beautiful images. But I would love to hear your thoughts. I know some people love these lenses. I know some people hate them. Some people think they have a lot of flaws. Some people think those flaws are just a part of the character. Let me know in your comments below what you think about those lenses and whether or not it's worth pulling the trigger on something like that, when ultimately no client is asking me for this. It would just sort of be my own self-satisfaction in creating the kind of image I want to create. So that was my week. If you've got any questions about my shoots, gear decisions, or trying to make this videographer thing work long term, drop them in the comments below. This is a weekly series that I'm really excited to dive into, posting weekly from the attic, breaking down my week, lessons I'm learning in cinematography, in videography, in building a freelance career, talking about gear sometimes, but also talking about really practical, on the ground tips and tricks and just pieces that I'm learning. So let me know your questions in the comments below. I'll be sure to answer those in future episodes. Appreciate you guys hanging out, and I'll catch you next week.